Today I'm taking a look at a watch that I think is pretty exciting, and that's the new Timex Q. This one really came out, I think, a couple weeks ago, kind of early December off the top of my head, and really grabbed me. I think it has a really interesting value, and let's take a closer look. So we have a diameter of 36 millimeters, lug to lug of about 42, height of 12.5 millimeters, and a lug width of, they quote 16 on the website, it's actually 18 millimeters here, and then it goes out to closer to 21 at the actual lugs. Inside, through a closed case back, of course, we're gonna have just a standard quartz movement. They don't state really where the quartz movement is or what type of quartz movement they're using, but it's a pretty decent quartz movement and doesn't have a lot of wobble to the seconds hand, which is nice. We also do have this battery latch case that makes changing the battery a lot easier. There is a domed acrylic crystal here, and very heavily domed, which is, I think, nice and gives it that vintage aesthetic. We have 50 meters of stated water resistance. It's just a regular push-pull crown though. And the watch is full stainless steel, even though it's done in a PVD gold tone to give it this kind of shine. And really, last but not least, the watch retails directly from Timex for $199. So taking a closer look at this dial, and I mean, they did a fantastic job here. It's one of those things where at the end of the day, it's Lapis Lazuli. It is a little bit dependent on what kind of stone, what kind of cut you're getting, to how quote unquote pretty the actual dial will be. But what I do love, and they do show it in press photos, so I'm sure there are multiple versions out there that have a similar dial to this. You get this very deep, rich blue tone that's super saturated. And then you get these flicks of gold in there, just depending on, of course, your slab. Now these are pyrite. It's part of the, Lapis Lazuli process. You have other areas that can look more white. I'll include a video right here where basically I compared it to a previous version that I ordered, and it was very different. So here, side by side, we can just see how different these slabs of lapis can be. Here with the one on the left, it is much more white in appearance. It has a lot more of a grayish tone to it. It truly doesn't even look as blue as the one on the right. You do still have that beautiful golden speck that comes out throughout the dial depending on the angle, but it is one of those things where it is not quite as blue as I was expecting, and it might be nice to some people, but not quite what I was expecting for the watch. So if in that case you find something like this and it is not to your liking, you could always just try to reorder it. For example, this is the next one that I got in, which was much more of something that I imagined when I was buying the watch. A much more deep, dark, lustrous blue. You have a little bit of those whiter, grayer marks, but it's not as prevalent as it is here. It's more marble-esque here. It's very much taking over the dial and making it almost not a blue dial at all, whereas here, very much so blue, and just a good balance of all the aesthetics that we have going on with the stone cut. And by comparison, if I bring in the malachite version, of course, same watch, same dimensions, same yellow gold tone, but here we have that malachite cut. So again, we're gonna have that green bezel to it. We're gonna have green on the edge of the bezel, and I believe probably a PVD tone, and that beautiful malachite cut. Not every cut's gonna be this perfect linear type styling. You can even see towards the very, very top of this one, it has a little bit more of a curvature to it. So, your mileage may vary. I do think the green malachites on average will probably look a little bit better just because you have that beautiful stone, deep, lustrous color. Whereas I think with the lapis, you're gonna get a lot more variation in color than you do with the malachite. Here we have some pretty good examples of what Timex can really do. The fact that they're such a large company lets them be able to create things at this level for this price point. We'll put them all on wrist. Here we have the malachite, beautiful, deep, rich, with the green and the gold. Here we have the much grayer of the lapis. Still good looking overall, just not a dial that I was particularly looking for with this model. Lastly, the very deep, super blue lapis. But coming back to this very pretty guy, we have just a very simple Timex Q layout here. We have an almost diver-esque style layout. We have these circular pips here in these two sections. This more rectangular prism type shape for the 3, 6, and 9. Of course, the triangle at 12. I really do like the dial. It feels very harmonious. The rectangular shape introduced here is basically just mirroring the actual minutes hand. And then, the actual circular markers are mirroring the hour hand. And the triangle there's triangles everywhere. So nothing feels out of place, nothing feels forced, and it is just, I think, a dial with a lot of nice harmony. A really nice touch for this watch is they decided to go for the text in a gold tone, which I just love here. Of course, the entire watch is done in gold, and I think that is almost like a pseudo blind logo application. It doesn't pop off the dial like crazy. It's not super in your face. It's not as bright as the indices or the Lume, for example. It just has this very nice subtle appearance. The Q Timex logo at 12 being actually applied, so that one does catch the light and grab your eye a little bit. But then the text down at 6 o'clock just being printed and looks pretty great. I love the way it ties into those little gold flecks on the dial as well. And of course, all the hands and the indices are done in that same gold tone just to match with the rest of the watch. How will this change over time? I'm not quite sure. It is a PVD process, so it shouldn't really discolor too much, but you of course might get some scratches which make the stainless steel probably shine through a little bit, but I don't think it'll look too bad over time. And thankfully you have the beautiful blue stone doing a lot of the heavy work here. And right before we move on, I would just want to say it is really nice, I think, how much contrast you get from the Lume on this dial. It's not going to be the strongest Lume in the world, but because it's such a pure white tone against the rest of the dial, it looks pretty premium. It really stands out, and it draws your attention to actually wanting to tell the time, which I think should be an important part for a watch. So taking a look at this dial under macro, and of course it's pretty. It's one of those things where, again, this is down to the luck of you getting the right stone and the right aesthetic for you. But you have this grainy, rocky texture because, well, this is basically a rock. And you have the beautiful specks that add a little bit of depth to it. It is just a, not uniform surface, which is nice because you get these deep, deep saturated blues. You get different shades of blues throughout the dial itself. You have some of these specks of white, some of these specks of gray, some of these specks of gold, some of these little almost black areas, and it just comes together to create this very unique canvas, this super interesting visual thing that almost has this cosmic kind of feel about it. And I think undoubtedly just ends up being pretty good to look at. Of course, we have the Timex applied logo there. It's done really well. I don't see any scratches or really anything wrong with the application there. It's done, I think, to a pretty good standard. The hands themselves are all fully polished. There's no fastening done here. But similar to that logo itself, it's a really well done handset. There really aren't any glaring QC issues that I see. There isn't any scratching or marking along the surface of any of the hands, which is very rare to see. The only thing I will note is right there, kind of towards the middle of where the camera's focusing, you can see a little tiny bit of Lume is taken out of that surface. So it's not the smoothest Lume application there. To be honest, I never noticed that until we zoomed in, so it's really not that big of a deal. And besides that, the Lume actually is applied super well. We do just see it's pretty fine, pretty powdery. There aren't any large chunks missing anywhere else, so I think that can be forgiven. Looking around, the only true QC issue I could find is this 12 o'clock marker has a little bit of, I don't know if it's glue or just scratching or some kind of weird residue here at the 12 o'clock. It is what it is. It is not the prettiest to see here, especially since every other marker is really well done. But I think based on how good the rest of the dial looks, that can be forgiven, and it's not something I really notice from wrist view. Kind of taking a second to let the light fall over the markers. You can see there's a little bit of a waviness, a little bit of a texture to the metal itself. So again, this isn't the highest quality application. We're not expecting beautiful, hot horology here. I think for what they did, I love the roundedness, the three-dimensionality to the markers themselves, the fact that the Lume is in a little bit of a lower plane than the marker, and the marker raises just a little bit above it. To me, it looks fantastic, and there isn't really much to kind of point out as being done incorrectly. Looking at the applied text here, I like how it's done. I think it has a tasteful amount of thickness to it. It's not too flatly printed. It has a nice font to it. Overall, it's done in a color that really complements the rest of the tones on the dial. And the same goes for, of course, the seconds track, done in that exact same printing as the text here. It is done well. It's something that, honestly, it doesn't really shout out at you. It's pretty subtle overall and blends into the rest of the design. It's a beautiful dial overall, and I think the important thing that Timex did here is they didn't add any weird elements that really took away from the natural beauty of this Lapis stone. It is fantastic. It's shining beautifully. It has all these tones inside of it, and all the gold tones on the Timex only serve to complement that. Even the white tones, you can find some whiter tones in the Lapis as well. So there's no color introduced here that wasn't already here naturally, which is cool.
Taking a look in direct natural light, we can see the dial can be a little bit overblown, especially that Timex logo can be a little bit more legible and kind of just hard to read. It just looks like a sparkly thing in direct light. But the blue dial still looks nice. You still get a good depth of color. You still see the range of colors that appear in the dial, and kind of at off angles you get that more deeper saturated tone. But you know, direct on it can look a little overblown, a little bit much. Going into more of a shaded light, you can see the dial takes on this much deeper, darker tone. It feels more saturated. It feels more, honestly, premium with the sheen that it gives off now. It's more glossy in this type of environment. So to me, it looks fantastic. This is almost like a more in between shaded and sunny, and you can see the gold pops a lot more. The dial is still pretty much the same, and it just is a good looking watch.
So moving on to the case of this watch, and this is the simple classic Timex Q case shape. It is actually a pretty nice case shape considering the price point as well. It's not just simple, it's not kind of one note. Looking a little bit more generally, we do have just a flat top surface that is done in full high polished. We then have a chamfer here along the edge that is done in high polish as well. The sides of the case are done in high polished, but you have these hooded lugs that are done in a brushed finish. You can see right there, this has this brushing defect in it. You can really tell right there. That's the way the watch came. It had a little bit of a defect right out of the box. It's not something you notice overly often, especially since that's the part that's kind of away from you on the wrist, but it's just something I thought I should mention. There's a possibility of the watch not being perfect, and the unfortunate part about ordering this one is you can order it in, get a actual dial slab that you're in love with, and then the case is ruined and you just have to exchange it for a different watch and maybe not like the dial as much. So that's a kind of tough point and something where you might have to just live with the state it comes in. Even though we have a vertical brushing here on the hooded lugs, we do have a vertical brushing here for the rest of the bracelet, which I think is an interesting point. I think they should have probably just done vertical brushing here on the lugs anyway. I don't know. I'm not a watch designer. Maybe that's not how it's meant to be, but I think that would have just made a little bit more sense. What is really fun is we do have the expandable bracelet here, super comfortable on wrist. It's probably not for people with hairier wrists, because even with my wrist, which is not the hairiest, it can pull and grab hairs every now and then. So it's one of those things where maybe this isn't for you, and that's unfortunate because this is pretty much the only thing it goes on. We do have this beautiful rectangular link, and I just think it looks interesting. It looks different. It's not a style of bracelet we see really in the modern age, or this even link style overall. So I like that it gives it this unique feel. This taper that the bracelet has as well is just really interesting. I think the fact that the watch bracelet tapers out to match the lines of the case as well is just a really nice touch. It's designed very well and is a really unique case, and probably one of the most interesting cases at this price point. You can even tell there, if I get it at the right angle, you have a multifaceted mid case. So you have this top facet that kind of goes towards the top, and you have the bottom facet that goes in towards the bottom, and it's just an interesting thing where they did not have to do that at all. Maybe that's what the original looked like, but they could have streamlined it, they could have quote unquote modernized it and cheapified it, if that's even a word, but they did it, and they went the extra mile to make an actual interesting case shape, and it looks good. Something I didn't notice until after owning the watch for a bit is you have this PVD ring around the outside of the bezel. To me, that cheapens it just a slight bit. I wish that wasn't there. Had they have done that in a gold tone, I think it would have looked a little bit better, a little bit more premium, but it's not the end of the world. You have the blue matching the rest of the blue on the bezel there, so it's a give and take. Speaking of the bezel, it's done just as well as the rest of the watch. You have this deep blue tone that matches with the dial, with the Lapis itself. You have gold for all the numerals, and it just ties in beautifully. It ties in beautifully with the gold tones in the watch, in the dial, and there really isn't much I can complain about. It is pretty easy to move. I mean, we don't have any friction, we don't have any click. It is a frictionless bezel. One thing, after just playing with the bezel a little bit more, I will say it could use a little bit of a better, more defined knurling. It's not the easiest to grip. It just is a little bit slick. So that's something they could refine, do some more defined teeth. But as it is, it's probably not a bezel you're going to be moving that much, so it's not that much of a deal breaker. And the benefit of this being a frictionless bezel is it can always be aligned. You don't have to worry about alignment issues, which is great. The crown is a little on the small side, but I think it's not bad. You're not operating it too much. It's not a hand wound. It's just, you know, push pull. There's only one position. It's a true no date movement, which is good as well. What I do like too is the clicks the movement of the seconds hand is very defined. It's not a jittery or soft seconds hand. It's not very wobbly. Does it line up with every single marker? Not quite, but I'm not too much of a stickler for that. So let's move on to how this watch wears. Earlier I was wearing what I think is probably one of the better value quartz watches out there, this kind of pebble-esque watch from Armatron. So here we have the watch sitting on my 6.5-inch wrist, and I think you can tell it fits pretty perfectly. What's really nice about this K-shape is it's a relatively short lug to lug just to begin with, but because of the way the bracelet articulates, it's basically like a lugless watch. It doesn't extend out lengthwise very much at all. So it's a really compact wearing watch. It's super comfortable because of that, you know, stretchy bracelet. It's one of those things where I could even probably go one tighter, but this is a very nice fit. It kind of goes over the bone a little bit. If it gets too hot outside, it's a little bit more stuck. So it's a nice in between, and it's nice to have that adjustability as it gets hot outside or as it gets cold. And you have that extra flexion. I move the watch up a little bit, I have closer to a 6-inch wrist there, and you can see still fits pretty much perfectly, still a lot of clearance on each side of the wrist itself. Still looks great. Looking from the side view, you can see it doesn't really rise up off the wrist at all too much. It has a really nice, I wouldn't even say curvature to that mid case, it's more the fact that the case back isn't too thick and the watch isn't weirdly proportioned. So it wears nicely on the wrist, it feels comfortable. Again, the bracelet feels comfortable. If you have a little bit too much hair on the wrist, it might not be as comfortable, but I haven't had too much problem personally with it tugging and pulling. Now bear with me, I don't really have many 18mm watch straps, so I have this gray Archer silicone, but you can tell it's a very weird appearance. It starts to feel a little bit like a, you know, really small legs on a bodybuilder kind of situation. It goes up to too large of an opening at the actual lugs to where it feels undersized when you put an 18mm strap on it. So unfortunately, if you're wanting to put aftermarket straps on this, you have to really find someone who will make a strap that goes from 18 to 20, then tapers back down. There we have that guy on the wrist. Again, not my cup of tea. Doesn't look quite right in my opinion, but if you want to make it feel very dainty, then sure, this might do that. So taking a look at the lume here, and it's not done terribly. It's a little bit brighter on camera than it's appearing in person. It's a little bit more of that C3 kind of glow, but I'm happy that the actual plain in the light lume signature is very, very white when it's not glowing, which just looks great on the watch. We're not introducing any weird green tones. The lume here, not going to last forever, not very bright, but at least for, you know, a 30 minutes or so, it's going to be relatively readable. We don't have any lume on the seconds hand though, which to me is not a deal breaker. Giving it a quick relume and comparing to the classic Snoopy. Of course, Snoopy more of a BGW9 type blue glow, Snoopy much brighter. This is Timex versus Timex, so it's unfortunate that the Q doesn't have Indiglow. I do think it could be kind of cool if Timex could in some way create an Indiglow that only glows on the markers. I don't know how they would connect that to the hands at the end of the day, but just a thought. Overall, not terrible lume, but they could absolutely have more application. So pros and cons of this Timex, and one of the biggest pros for me, of course, is just the dial. The fact that you're getting a Lapis Lazuli stone dial for this price point, I think is awesome. The fact that it can look so good is awesome. The depth of color that you get, the specks of gold that you get on the dial, it just is very good to look at. But it does come with a caveat in the sense of course, every single dial is going to be a little bit different. So like I showed earlier in the video, you might not get a dial that looks like this, but also this might not be the dial for you. You might want something a little bit more muted, something with a little less gold on it. So that probably exists out there. The unfortunate part is you can't pick that exact model. Another huge pro for this watch is the fit and the overall comfort. This expansion band with how much it can expand and the fact with little movements and flexions, it is just super comfortable on wrist. It's hard to beat. Does it suck a little bit getting it on and off because like the way the bracelet can pull? Sure, but it's not really the end of the world, and I think for the price point it can be understood that this is not going to be the most premium feeling thing on the planet, but for the price point that we're working with, for how good it feels on wrist and how pretty nice that it looks, I really can't complain too much. And kind of touching on some of those earlier points, I think the price point here is pretty fantastic. We're talking about $200, talking about stone dials. Honestly, I went on like a little bit of a search and I couldn't really find stone dials for really any cheaper. You can get some maybe like weird Etsy things or things like that, but you're really typically looking at $300-400 bare minimum. Sure, some of those will have automatic movements and that's going to be adding to the price point, but even with quartz options, there's not really a lot out there. So this is offering really unique value. I think it's doing the stone dial justice in a package that actually is nice and not just a gimmick. And it's awesome to kind of commoditize this stone dial because we see them in Rolexes, we see them in APs and all this other stuff. So it's nice to see something that pretty much anyone can buy. Moving on to cons, one of the bigger cons for me is it only comes in this gold tone. I'm not the biggest fan of yellow gold. To be fair, I kind of like this watch, so yeah, that's changing a little bit. But would I have preferred it in steel? Probably. Not to say this is badly done. I mean, yellow gold and blue is a very common combination that usually looks pretty good together. But as it's executed here, I think I would have liked to see more variation, offer a stainless steel version. Maybe they will do that in the future depending on the success of this model. But for right now, you only can get it in gold. So you have to bear with it. Another con for me is the dial can be a little overblown in the sun. It can be a little washed out. It's hard to read the Timex logo. Sometimes the stone doesn't look as pretty in really harsh direct sunlight. But it's one of those things where you're gonna have to kind of just decide for yourself, do I spend most of my time in direct harsh sunlight, or am I usually under trees, in a car, in kind of more synthetic indoor lighting? Because in all those situations, the dial looks fantastic. And the way that the watch shines and sparkles and feels as a total package is awesome in those situations. So if you're finding yourself more in those situations, it's fantastic. If you're kind of planning on wearing this watch a lot in direct outdoor lighting, maybe it's not as good of an option. And as I touched on a little bit in the pros, every dial is unique. And to me, that's a con, just in terms of you might buy one and not like it. You know, I bought the first version and I was excited to get the watch in, and I didn't like it. So I reordered a different one, which was this, and it turned out to be fantastic on what I was expecting out of the watch. It's a little bit of a hassle to have to buy something and return it and see if you get a new one. And there's no guarantee that the second, third, or fourth one you buy will be a better version. It might be something you also don't like. So it's a little bit of a hassle to get the exact version you want. A little bit tough. So that's just an unfortunate kind of luck of the draw kind of thing. And to me, that's a con because you don't know what you're getting into. But I understand this is a natural stone. There's going to be variation. It's just hard to go, oh, I'm in love with this watch. This is what I want. And then maybe be disappointed when it comes in. The final thoughts, and I think this watch is amazing, amazing value. Yes, it's quartz and some people won't like that, but I don't think that's a bad thing. It's nice to have a grab and go quartz watch. It's nice to have something that's always accurate, always on time, and it's not going to cost as much to service down the road. What's nice too is here we have a quartz movement that doesn't feel jittery, it doesn't look cheap, it doesn't act cheap, so it does feel high quality. And the rest of the watch, I think, benefits from it being a quartz movement because that's honestly where they're probably saving the most money in a sense. The bracelet is good quality, the case finishing is good, the dial obviously is probably a little bit on the expensive side for the rest of the watch. So I'm much happier with this being quartz than it being a, let's say, $300 or $400 automatic. To be fair, would I buy it if it was a $300 or $400 automatic? Probably. But I do like the option that it is the quartz and that it is at a relatively accessible price point. I love the way this 36mm case fits. It's comfortable. Again, I think this dial and the whole package looks a lot more expensive than you would expect the price point to suggest. So especially because Timex tends to have sales, or you tend to be able to find them on eBay for cheaper, you'll probably find this watch for $150, $130 depending on how patient you are. And that's a really, really good deal for what you're getting. I'd personally argue, as long as you're okay with the aesthetic of the Timex Q, this is probably a watch that everyone should try to own or should consider at some point. Because it is fun, it is comfortable, it's a nice kind of daily watch. Sure, it's not sapphire, sure, it's not this, sure, it's not that, but it has so much of a unique flair about it. It has so much X factor that it undoubtedly can stand up in a watch box, and it undoubtedly could be a very fun watch to wear. I've had this watch for about 3 weeks, and it's probably been my most worn watch in that time. And that says a lot because I go through watches a lot and I review watches and I have watches that I want to wear, but this is consistently finding its way on my wrist, and that's because it is just well done. But anyway, those are my final thoughts and my ramblings. Let me know what you think. Let me know what they did right, what they did wrong for this watch, what you would like to see in the future potentially, and just generally what you think about this watch. I'm curious to know, am I alone in thinking it's awesome? Am I alone in thinking this is one of the best values in watchmaking right now? Maybe I am, but let me know down below. Thank you as always for watching the video. Hope you got something out of it, and I will see you in another one.